everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host kushalmehra. All right, my guest today is, and I apologize in advance if I butcher her last name because in India we pronounce things in a different way. So my guest today is Catherine Perez-Shakdam. I don't know how to get it right, so I
You did.
apologize in it. I
You
did
did.
get it right.
You did get it
I,
right.
Awesome. See, I did not want to ask you before we started. I wanted to take a risk. I was like, if I get it right, I get accolades. If I don't get it right, I get brickbats. So I get it right. So Catherine is a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. She's also a journalist. You can read Catherine's work in multiple portals, including the Jerusalem Post. And Catherine in 2017 was the only Western journalist or a media personality to have been granted an interview with the now president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi. So, Catherine, welcome.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
So, as everybody who must have clicked the link knows, that today's podcast topic is Islamism in Iran, and I don't want to get into defining Islamism because that we've done already in a previous podcast with another person who I met through the Henry Jackson Society, Wasik. So Wasik
Ah,
had explained the entire process of what Islamism is. But as I was talking to you offline, Catherine, today our focus is on Islamism in Iran.
mhm.
Now, if if I was to build from there, what are the underlying principles of Islamism from an Iranian perspective?
That's a really good question. I have to take it back to the governance of the juries, which is, the system of governance that Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini decided to bring to life, I would say. And a lot of it was based on his understanding and study of pan-Islamism as expressed by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which is quite interesting. Now, obviously, you have it's a different iteration of Islamism because of the Shia nature of it. It's a different school of thought within Islam, of course. Um, and the way that he conceptualized it, he wanted to have, at the very forefront, I would say, of the leadership, the government, the overarching, I would say, bastion of, keeper of Islamic tradition, Shia Islamic tradition, had to be for him a jurist, an imam, an ayatollah. And that meant that everything had to go through him in order to bring to life, this holy government that they're actually awaiting through the advent of Imam Mahdi. So what he tried to do was to precipitate the return of Imam Mahdi by creating or inventing his government here on earth. So it's quite interesting because he's basically basing his legitimacy on this ideal, this promise that a man would come or return, depending on how you want to look at it, and bring justice to the world through his system of governance. That he wanted to create that prior to his return, and that he would take ownership of this and draw legitimacy from the stories and tradition of Shia Islam promising the return of that man, and kind of take it upon himself to imbue himself with this power, this legitimacy. So it's quite interesting because in my mind it's a form of theocracy. It's not too dissimilar from what the Pope did very early days of Christianity in setting up the Vatican and deciding that the church would have an empire and rule over by virtue of holy legitimacy. Now, in terms of what that means on the ground, basically that all powers, lead to him, that he appoints everyone and decides everything, and that basically people's only right is to submit to his will, but also any form of either aggression or criticism is actually understood as an act of apostasy and rebellion against God, which is quite interesting when you think about it, for any system of governance to actually, play the God card, as if they're the only one being able to interpret what is it that God wishes, or how people should even conduct their life, or any decision that has to do with the government, is somewhat linked to the expression of the holy. It's quite interesting. And I think that's the only difference. I think that when you look at Islamism, the Sunni Islamism, at least the Muslim Brotherhood, it's expressed slightly differently. I think the claims they made are different because they don't claim holy legitimacy. They don't claim to be appointed by God, which is something that Khomeini may not have claimed, but Khamenei certainly is. He's not saying it directly, but if you look at what happened just a week ago with the cartoons that the Charlie Hebdo published, the leadership came out in Iran saying that obviously they were not happy because it's a criticism of the leadership, but also that they understood that as being a violation of the sanctity of Islam. And by doing so, you basically saying that Ayatollah Khamenei is somewhat now Shia Islam, and that any criticism of that, equates to an act of apostasy, which is insanity to me, because I don't think that it's almost a cult of the personality now, because you're aligning this man, on the level of not just prophethood, but actually the divine with a capital D, which I think is a slip. And Sunni Islam cannot do that because again they conceptualize Islam very differently. The exercise of their faith does not allow for people to be put on the same level as God or even prophets. So yeah, it's quite interesting to see that there's been an evolution. There's a trajectory that is actually quite dangerous from, I would say, regular Shia Islam, which is completely different than what Iran came out with, and this slip towards this cult of the personality and the notion now that Khamenei is actually claiming the status of imamhood, prophethood, and now the divine.
But that's fascinating because in that scenario, that is a huge deviation in the case of Shia Islam from Sunni Islam, because in Shia Islam, you are in a very weird way doing the one thing that they don't like, which is kind of idolatry,
Yes.
because they are the so so I guess eventually all roads lead to politics, and politics is about control and power. So whatever gets me power, and in societies that are not secularized in the classical sense as Western societies are, I guess this is the easiest way to stay in power. Because if I was to look at Saudi Arabian society, right, now with the developments that have been done under Muhammad Salman, and but the division in Saudi society, from whatever I have understood, has always been clear. There are some things that the monarch handles, and there are some things that the Grand Mufti handles. And they're very clear, actually. On most issues, they don't have any conflict with each other. I mean, now with the new prince rising, I think the prince is entering the Mufti's domain about social issues, and I think they might face problems. But in Iran, like, what is this demarcation, or is there any?
No, there's none. There's none. That's the thing. So, I mean, on paper, they tell you that there is. On paper, the government is supposed to be independent, from the leadership. But the leadership is there to ensure that there's no deviation from, the Islamic path. But in reality, what that means is that, Khamenei can, micromanage if he wants to. But what is also quite interesting in Iran is that you have a system within a system. So when Ayatollah Khomeini very early on in the 1979 understood that in order to secure the longevity of the Islamic Revolution, he would have to create a structure that would protect. That sole purpose would be to protect the leadership. So and by the leadership I mean the ideology underwriting the Islamic Republic and this Islamic revolutionary movement. And then came to be RSGC. And as the year went by and RSGC gained a lot more power because they had to be given power, that means that RSGC came to infringe onto the political space and also the authority of state representative, including parliamentarians, which is interesting because it's supposed to be a republic, and so you have elections, obviously, but the power of elected MPs, for example, even the president and ministers, is actually largely challenged by RSGC. And that means that within every ministry, whether it's defense or intelligence or the economy, whatever it is, you have a section that is being run by RSGC. So they're almost acting, well, not almost, they are acting as a shadow government. But power, true power, lies with them. So a lot of the time, ministers cannot make decision unless they actually run it by the RSGC equivalent, their counterpart, which is, again, has led to this kind of like slip towards, fascism and authoritarianism in Iran, because there is no counterbalance. There is no separation of power. Everything is being run by the leadership, from education to, transportation, everything, even the air they breathe. And there's nothing they can do to reform it. That's the thing. And I think that's the current thing that you're seeing played out right now in Iran, where people sometimes are arguing, what about we reform the regime? What about we make it a real republic? What about this? What about that? It's impossible. You can't do this because we are it might be called the Islamic Republic of Iran, but there's nothing Islamic about it. There's nothing Republican about it. The only word that might be true is Iran in that. And reforming this is impossible. What you have to do is, put it down and start over, because the constitution doesn't even allow you, to do anything that could be understood as, again, an act of enmity against God. And the person deciding that is Khamenei. So how do you go about reforming? And also, it would be quite silly for him to suddenly wake up one morning and say, yes, I have absolute power in my country, but today I feel generous. I'm just going to share the love and give it back to the people. He would never do that. Why would he?
So I guess this takes me to the natural segue of what happened in Iran and what has been happening since then. It all started with the tragic death of Mahsa Amini, and so what the hell is this religious police? Who do they report to?
They report to the leadership.
Which leadership is so confusing.
The leadership is basically Khamenei. So in this case, maybe not him per se, because obviously, there's only 24 hours in a day. But people close to him. So he has a very, he has advisors and he has a council. So they would report to whoever is appointed, to that specific task, and then they report to Khamenei should they, if there's a problem or things are not happening the way that he wishes them to happen. So again, Khamenei wasn't the one that created the morality police. That was Khomeini. So he decided, again, early on, that he wanted to have the perfect Islamic society. And obviously, that meant controlling everything that women do, think, eat, and everything else in between. And so he decided that in order to keep them, on the program, that the morality police would be created and that this force would go around the streets of Iran, ensuring that, women are dressed adequately. That means, hair covering and the burqa, I think, which is called a chador in Iran. And that people behave in a decent way. So, no drinking in the streets and, all that kind of thing. So it's not just about the headscarf. But they have almost absolute power. So that means that they can at their discretion, either fine you or arrest you or beat you or do whatever it is that they wish to do on the day. And it's all justified because, again, if you challenge them, they will argue that you're committing an act of apostasy, that you're challenging the leadership, that you're acting against God's will, and that, since you're challenging the Quran, they can do pretty much whatever it is that they want to you, and that include the death penalty. Because an act of enmity against God in Iran is passible of death. So that tells you just how much power they had. And back in the 80s, they used to go around in the streets of Iran beating people up. And there was nothing that people could do against it. Now, over the decades, things had to change because, of course, Iranians were becoming a bit restless and arguing that they needed more freedom and that, this ruling on the headscarf was a bit antiquated and that they wanted more freedom, which Khamenei kind of conceded because he understood that he had to give them some freedom, he had to give us something. So he did. But then came around Ibrahim Raisi, who's I would say, in my mind, a radical, and obviously very conservative. And so he decided to roll back on those reforms and to go back to kind of, early Islamic Republic style of oppression. and enforcing, this religious diktat onto people. It didn't go down so well because obviously it's very difficult for people to be given, certain freedoms and then for someone to come and kind of roll it back, especially with, the advance of social media and the fact that Iranians not only are quite a young population, but also have access, to, again, social media. So they see how the world is evolving around them, and the rise of feminism, the notion that people have religious freedoms, and that also you could live within Islam, but not necessarily abide by antiquated rules that maybe they feel don't apply to them or that they don't want to follow, quite simply. So you've seen a backlash, I think, of that, and also I think it's been a compounding of things. It's not just about the morality police. It's also about high unemployment, about corruption, about a lack of a future, really, that they could identify with. And again, I think that because Iran is such a young population, this generation Z, as they called, there is a gap now between them and the regime. The regime has been unable to kind of project its agenda and its propaganda onto that demographic. They're not buying into it. They don't believe in it. A lot of Iranians identify as atheists in reaction to this Islamism that has been pushed onto them, and so they're just not buying the whole God argument. And they want free. They want their own democracy. They're not quite sure exactly what that means yet, in terms of would it be a constitutional monarchy? Would it be a republic? Would it be? It doesn't really matter for them at this point. What they want is to actually exercise freedom, have a discussion within the country about what would their democracy look like, how do they want to be governed, and they want equality too. Iran is composed of a multitude of ethnic minorities, from the Kurds to the Ahwazi to the Baluch, with very different history, different languages, different belief system, but they feel Iranian. And so they want to live together, but they also want to be equal before the law. They do not want to have a 3-speed society, 4-speed society, whereby Ahwazi are being discriminated against on the basis of their origins. It's the same for Baluchistan. It's the same for the Azeri region of Iran, or even the Kurds. And Iran, again, this elite leading the country has played the ethnic card, has been very sectarian in this approach, because of course Iran is majority Shia, but also you have different faiths within Iran. So you have Christians, you have Jews, although a very small minority now. You have Zoroastrians, you have Baha'i, you have Sunni Muslims, and up until the revolution, they lived quite happily together. There was great respect between communities, and I would say solidarity. And they understood that they had a lot to gain from learning from one another and respecting each other's tradition, because they were first and foremost Persian Iranians. And it's a shame that this. I feel that history is being rewritten. That those people are not given the courtesy of their tradition, and celebrating this history that they have, and learning from one another. Which for me is the most important thing. Is that we all are entitled to be different. It's about sharing those differences and actually find common grounds to then move society to the next stage. This is not being done in Iran, which is why people now are just fed up. They don't want to be divided. They don't want to hate each other. They don't want religion to come between them, because they have thousands of years of history. Iran is a very old country, and I think that what you see is, I would go as far as to say that you could see like a renaissance in Iran. The likes of which obviously happened a long time ago in the West. But I think this is what you see happening in Iran. There's an awakening. There's an understanding that they are more than what they were told, and that they need to look back in order to move forward. And when I say look back, pre-1979, and kind of rediscover who they are at their very core, their identity, what makes them Persian, what is it that unites them, as opposed to what is it that divides us, so that I could hate on you better.
Now, how does one respond to maybe replies like this? Um, the West tends to, I'm just giving the devil's advocate position over here. So the West tends to overestimate the tendency of other cultures and their love for freedom. That's point number one. The West in general speaks to elites in other societies, and they tend to have a, a disproportionate image of what that society really wants. Iran really wants the religious police, and they want Islam, and they want religion in every aspect of their society. So how does one respond to something like that?
I'm going to say, okay, so I agree to some of the statement that you made in the sense that, yes, the West speaks to the elite because it's impossible to speak to people in general. Who are they? So, you tend to speak to, leaders within communities, and of course, they are the elite. But it doesn't mean they don't represent the people. I think actually it's quite demeaning to say that, the elite of the country, like the elite of the country came out, for a reason. They made out of people. And it's not like they are better. I think it's just they have a platform that allows them, to speak on behalf of their people. Also, when it comes to freedom, I would argue that everyone wants freedom. I think it's a natural state. It's a natural want of any human being. How this is formulated, vary depending on your culture and where you come from. But I think that ultimately we all want freedom. How we conceptualize that freedom is quite different. Now, when it comes to Iran, I would say that, yeah, some people, may, project some of their own desires and agendas onto Iranians and say, oh, this is what they want. But I think that Iranians have done an incredible job at telling us what is it that they want. You have incredible, very courageous, activist people, both in Iran and, within the diaspora, telling us what is it that Iranians want. And I think that this is how I see my job as an expert on Iran, is to actually listen to what it is that they're saying, what they're telling me they want, and for me to carry that into my writing and my research, because I do not want to, this is not my job to project what is it that I want to see in the country. Obviously, I have my own agenda and I want certain things to happen, mainly that Israel be left alone. And that we return to the friendship that Iranians and Israelis had a long time ago. Well, not so, 43 years ago. It's not that long. And that the region, normalizes, relationship with everybody, and that, we could live in peace and actually prosper. That's my agenda. But my agenda is not, opposite to what Iranians want. They have said it time and time again. Again, I think they're doing a great job at telling us what is it that they want. We just need to be careful in reading into it and not, and again, allowing Iranians to formulate a solution for themselves, as opposed to us trying to kind of implement what we believe is the best thing for them to do, which most likely is better for us. We need to find a compromise. So again, I think communication, and also, I would say, a good dose of humility. The West hasn't been that great at doing that. I think humility is important. Again, this is not our history. They're writing their own. We're just there to accompany them, empower them, and ensure that obviously their interests are aligned with ours. And if not, how do we find a common ground to work together? Because ultimately, the world has gone so small because of social media, because of technology, that we can't, I can't oppress you and hope that I'm going to be okay. It's a case of we're all in this together. We have to find a way to move forward together. And that means, we need to have some conversations, hard ones. We need to be honest. We need to be respectful. And I think compassion would go a long way. And also drawing a line on history. So learning from it, colonialism and all the horrible things that did happen in the past, learning from it, not forgetting it, but also agreeing that, the son doesn't have to pay for the sin of his father. That we have to take it upon ourselves to forgive, move on, and actually make those hard choices that our children and the generations after that would benefit from. So we're going to have to swallow the hard pill in order for the next generation to actually, build from our sacrifice. And we would be foolish to think that we can't. This has to happen. You can't build a society in peace and democratic advancement if you don't, sometime, take it on the chin and just say, fine, it's going to suck for me for a little bit, but my kids and their kids after that will be able to make the right choices because I've made the hard decision and I've paid the price for it. But now things are better, and we need to be courageous in doing this.
You know what the problem in this entire process is? I always say this, especially because of America and its tendency to give people freedom and democracy in the classic American way, which nobody
Mhm.
really likes. And then America says, "No, trust me, you really need it." And then one fine day, Americans say, "Okay, we're going by."
Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree with you, but that's what I'm saying. I think we have an opportunity here with Iran to not do it again. We've done it in Iraq, we've done it in Libya, we've done it in Yemen to some extent, we've done it in Afghanistan, because we try to export a model that works for the West. But the West has a very different history and demographic. Afghanistan had, um, I don't want to say democracy, because they had a monarchy before that, but the way that the tribal system was set up was allowing, for some degree of democracy, and all we had to do was to build upon that. So to use a tradition, so something that is not foreign to them, something that they understand, something that is actually, made in Afghanistan, build from it and accompany them in that process. But we decided to say, no, 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 we're going to put our stamp onto it, and then boom, it's going to magically work. It didn't. We tried to do this in Iraq, didn't work either. We tried it in Yemen, didn't work either. Surprise, surprise. So I think it would be a mistake to kind of replicate. Also, insanity, the very definition of insanity, to just keep doing it again and say, like, why is it not working? Well, it didn't work, like 3 times, 5 times before. Why would it work now? I think again, it's from it comes from arrogance. It also comes from the fact that we're not listening to what people are telling us. And now there's this magic tool called social media, where people actually have now the ability to tell you what is it that they think, what is it that they want. We might just listen. Might be a good idea.
yeah. So this one's going to be a little long-winded question because I have to set it up properly. So sometimes what I notice in the discourse around democracies and other societies, I find one person writing a lot on this, but obviously Shadi Hamid. I don't know if you've read Shadi's work. Shadi works for the Brookings Institute in America. Shadi focuses more on the Arab Spring and
Mm-hmm.
that side of the world, not on Iran. He's focused more on the Sunni world, not on the Shia world. So Shadi's I've had him on the podcast twice. So two books, especially he talks about Islamic exceptionalism, and the recent book, I forgot the name. Sorry, Shadi, don't get mad at me for that. I'm very bad with book names, but I've read both of them and I thoroughly enjoyed them. So Shadi's whole take was that I think the Americans did not get the Arab Spring. They thought, here's this great moment of freedom, this is what they want. And what he basically in his new book talks about the idea of democratic minimalism, where basically the idea of how democracies should function or how democracies could function is actually
Mm-hmm.
very similar to what you're saying, to be very honest, which is refreshing to hear from one more person, was that look, do not impose standard set models on different societies because they come from very different tribal pasts. It's exactly what you're saying, by
Mm-hmm.
the
It's
way.
true.
So that's why I just wanted to share that there are others who also. And Shadi obviously is a practicing Muslim. He is an American,
Mm-hmm.
born and raised in America. But now I get to this quintessential problem when we have now the West is, and these are my views, you can reject them and disagree with them, but I just like how we look at different cultures, right? I look at, when I say the West, the West is diverse. Point taken, because the French are very different, the Germans are very different, the United Kingdom is very different, America is very different, Canada is very different. But in general, the West does have some overlying principles that they agree on. I mean, they used to. I correct myself. They no longer agree on anything. I don't know what they agree on anymore. And so I'll give you a small incident. There was, when this entire freedom movement and revolt was at its peak in Iran, there was a Iranian feminist. I forgot her name again. I really apologize for that. She was on TV, and there was this panelist. I don't remember which channel it was, because I barely watch media because I find it abhorrent. I genuinely find media abhorrent. And that person was talking down to that panelist all the time, as if she doesn't understand Iran. And again, why am I saying this? the West is going through this super, annuated or some guilt syndrome on steroids. Now the West has done bad things. Let me be the first one. I suffered, as in my country. My country suffered colonialism,
Mm-hmm.
but but there is a reality of colonialism, and then there is colonialism and the guilt associated with colonialism on steroids, where
Mm-hmm.
you start in that obsession, because the Western political landscape is changing, especially because your media landscape, and again I say it as clearly as possible, is left leaning. People may not like it, it is.
Mm-hmm.
And the left is now completely allied with Islamism.
Mm-hmm.
Like it or not, they are. And
This is true.
again,
I agree. I completely agree with that assessment. That's very, very true.
so how the hell does the West talk? It's like, what are they talking about in their own internal societies? I can tell you occasions after occasions where you can see their internal politics, and you go like, what? And then they talk like this outside. It makes no sense to me. Like, I'll give you an example. Justin Trudeau talks one thing in his own country, and then he says we're going to sanction Iran.
Look, I think the West suffer from cognitive dissonance, and also maybe a bit of schizophrenia. I'm not, I think we need an exorcism, and it's true. I'm not saying this, to make people laugh, but I genuinely think so. I like the fact that you mentioned, post-colonialism, because again, I think there's this narrative that has been built over the decades that we had, as a collective, the West, had to make amends, and somewhat fix the damages, that we did, to the former colonies. And I would agree with that assessment. The problem is we didn't actually have a conversation with the victims of colonialism saying, what would you guys like us to do to make it better? How can we have a little mea culpa, but actually, somewhat repair, what is it that we've done? Is there a way that we could, work together? That hasn't happened. So I think we kind of took it upon ourselves to make people forgive us. And the way that we went about doing it, and I can only speak on Iran because, I'm not an expert, for example, on India or other countries, is that we decided that we would use appeasement, and containment, as opposed to, military interventionism that was, again, understood as this, again, like, once again, the West is going after, conquering territories, and it's meddling and it's doing all these kind of things. And I'm not saying that we were not, but, we definitely made a lot of mistakes. But I think that the worst one that we've made is like to actually buy into this agenda that Islamists was pushing, because they very early on recognized that, the left is actually talking about certain issues that we can identify with and that we could push onto them because we agree. And that means that we could, be the Trojan horse, and that we could slowly infiltrate and then kind of like redirect the narrative and use the guilt of post-colonialism to force people to not be critical of what is it that we're talking about, what we're saying, and how we kind of like pushing the agenda in a very different direction. Because, the notion that the left, which is essentially talking about, personal freedom and compassion and, social issues, a lot more than, I would say, conservative, who are more interested in, democratic advancement, security, and of course the economy. The left tends to be more socialist by definition, and so the Islamists saw an opportunity there. And it's crazy to see that, for example, they have promoted the notion that women, need to be covered up and have to be told what to do and what to wear and where to walk and who to marry and all those kind of things. And the left is cool with it, even though the left is actually promoting, for example, gender equality and sexual emancipation, for example, and all those different things. Those things don't work together. But for some reason, again, cognitive dissonance made it so that somehow it works. And you can have people advocating and somewhat sanctioning genocide on one hand, because when Iran goes out and says death to America, death to Israel, this is an act of genocide. even though, I mean, they haven't committed the act of genocide per se, but, I do believe that, words turn into action. And I do believe that when you send those, dynamics onto the universe, well, you're calling for, the actions to kind of follow your words. So it's an act of genocide for me. It doesn't work with, for example, anti-racism stance and, again, gender equality and all those, very social issues that they kind of like, championing. So how did they come about, making this alliance? I think it's an interesting thing. And I think that it is very cool. The way that Islamists managed to kind of infiltrate and take over the left was that they had a very common enemy, the Jews. Anti-Semitism made it all better because they could agree on that. And also, again, the notion that by hating on certain demographic, which they felt, were troubling them in that they didn't fit the mold, they found common ground. And I think that this is a danger. This is a danger, is that the left decided to talk about equality by exiling a certain demographic. So it's not exactly equality for all, it's equality for the people that they appointed to have, the pleasure of being equal, but not everyone. But hey.
So let's talk about anti-Semitism. I can relate to a lot of it as a Hindu, because if one was to just open the pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Guardian really loves the Hindu community. I have to say they have some special love.
I think we have common ground here because they have special love for us too. So we are friends there. I hear you and I get you.
So what's with this? If I remember, mainstream media, whether people like it or not, when I say mainstream media, I mean left-leaning media. Fox News is just the exception, and there are a few outlets globally that might be openly right-wing. Not that being right-wing is a problem. I am a capitalist to the core. I don't even hide it. Like, I'm very open about it. But the point is that by and large, the discourse, whether it's academia, I mean, there are surveys in the West that show 95% of American academia, barring economics departments, or 90%, are Democrats. They don't even hide it. They say they're Democrats. They don't even say left wing. They say they're Democrats. So in such a scenario, where, I mean, if I remember reading old articles and from the archives from the 60s, the 70s, and 80s, so where did this turn come from? Israel being the root of all evil and anti-Semitism just being fine. Like it just flows off people's mouths like songs.
Look, I think we had a golden decade. 60s, 70s, when it came to anti-Semitism, was good because, I mean, it was retreating. People were not buying into it. I don't think it ever really went away, which is why I think this is where we failed. We failed to understand that less was not, that did not equate to it's gone. It was still there. And I think that the Soviet Union, even though it was one of the first countries to recognize Israel, did a really great job at promoting it, the whole anti-Semitism. And then obviously, I think that political development in the Middle East, in relation to the various wars that Israel had to fight against its Arab neighbors, the rise of pan-Arabism, pan-Islamism fed into it, where people started to then, conflate Judaism, the Jews, and of course Israel. And I'm not saying that they are divorced because it's very difficult. I mean, as a Jew, I just find it's part of my identity, even though I'm not Israeli. Israel is part of my identity. And I understand we have a very, I would say, visceral, organic, relationship with Israel. And people have a very, kind of experience differently. But I see personally, I see Israel as an extension and an expression of my identity and vice versa. So I feel that whenever Israel speaks, it somewhat relates to me. I feel that everything that I do, somewhat, again, is always with the understanding that, Israel matters and needs to be protected. I'm talking about Israel as the country. I'm not talking about one particular political parties. And that obviously, for me, it's kind of, I would say, it's one of my buttons. When people are quite critical of Israel, I tend to be quite territorial and not necessarily take offense, but I get a bit defensive, and I always want to make sure that the criticism is objective and well-meaning, as opposed to being critical for the sake of just bashing on Israel and the Jews by extension. So it's a complicated issue, and I think that people jump onto it, understanding that because the Jews are such, I would say, an exceptional people, and I'm not saying we better, I'm saying exceptional in the sense that our identity is very complicated to explain. In that, again, we are an ethno-religion. So, our connection to the land of Israel is part of us. And we are the land and the land is us. I would say that's the easiest explanation that I could give. And again, Judaism is not a religion per se. There's no word religion in the Torah, for example. It's not. It's a covenant that we have with the divine. So we don't call ourselves a religion necessarily. That's what people have called us and classified us as, but we don't necessarily identify with it. So I think that by this token, we are quite exceptional in that we don't feel the particular mold. We kind of sit outside, and that has led to different problems. So now to go back to anti-Semitism, again, I think that geopolitical development, Soviet Union, the way that the left was going, the conspiracy theories being pushed onto the world consciousness in terms of, on the one hand, you had the Jews, those evil capitalists, trying to control everything, and they are the very expression of, colonialism. But also the notion that, people tend to forget that, for example, Israel was built literally on a Zionist leftist movement. The kibbutz, or, not too dissimilar to what, Soviet Russia wanted to turn the country into. And so, there was this notion too that Jews are victims, but they're also the one perpetrating the crimes, and that, they control the media, they control politics, they control everything that's going on in the world. And yet the Shoah happened. So, how do you reconcile the two notions? And so forever, whether in the right or in the left, we were the pariahs. We were the people to be hated on. We were, together the victims and also the people wielding the axe. We were the one that cannot be trusted. And I think that was fed into, this leftist agenda, fed by this Islamist agenda, obviously, because it kind of fitted the narrative as well. This notion that the Jews had to be isolated, that Israel had to be delegitimized, that they had to reclaim their land, which is by essence, by the way, the very expression of colonialism, because they want to reclaim the land to take it away from us when we are indigenous to the land. But I'm not going to start on that conversation. It's for another time. But I think it's quite interesting. And the left bought into it because it worked, and I think it played into a desire, I would say, like a yearning that they had to just be anti-Semitic. I think for them it was fun. It's part of the left identity. I'm sorry to say, and I'm not leveling a criticism at the left, and I'm not saying that all leftists are anti-Semitic. I'm saying that the left as a movement, the way that it's being expressed today, is profoundly anti-Semitic. But now they call it anti-Zionism. Because obviously using a euphemism is a lot better, because nobody wants to come across and say, hey, I'm a racist, I don't like you. So they will usually say, I'm not racist, but, and they will find a lot of ways to rationalize their rejections of you. And I think that the Hindu community has suffered a great deal from that, because I feel, and correct me if I'm wrong, that whatever the Jews have suffered over the past decades, has slowly kind of like been passed on, and the formula being used to systematically delegitimize, criticize, isolate Jews and Israel has been literally copy pasted and slammed onto you, and you're suffering, from the same thing. Where again, if India does anything, oh, the Hindu community is to blame. If the Hindu community is doing anything, oh, it's an Indian agenda, blah blah blah. And you're like, hello, we could exist separately from India, living in the diaspora, but also, do we care about where we come from? And India is still a country that we hold dearly. Yes, you should be entitled to do that. You can be British and celebrate your, celebrate India as your country of origin and say that, the two are not necessarily, incompatible. You could be both. It's a thing. Like, you could, people are quite complex, and they could have, various identities within themselves, without, being called a traitor or having an agenda that is nefarious to, where, the country that they live in, like, for example, Britain. So yeah, I just find it quite fascinating, and I think that we need to look into it a lot more. And again, have those very, hard conversations. We need to be honest, and it's because it's a dynamic. I think that we can't also run away from the fact that we may, when I say we, for example, Israel and the world, the world jury, maybe, had played a part into this. Maybe we could have done better in trying to, to address the issue. And I think that the best way, I would say, to defeat anti-Semitism is actually to stand proudly in our difference and our Judaism. However, it's being expressed. I'm not a religious person, so I'm more a secular Jew. But it doesn't mean that I can't be proud of my history, my origin, and my faith, even though I don't,
Yeah. So what's fascinating? Another thing that Jews and Hindus, the two community have in common is that you have a lot of atheist Jews, and like I don't use the word atheist for myself, but in India, in the Hindu culture, the disbelief was embedded in the structure itself. So there were different schools, and there was the disbelieving schools. They were called Nastikas or Nirishwarvadis in Sanskrit, loosely translated as skeptics or disbelievers. So we have that in common, that the two cultures actually understand each other is because they're okay with disbelief, and they're fine with disbelievers inside their fold,
Are
because
you
just like,
saying that you guys are tolerant of other people? Is that what you're saying? It's a
yeah, that's
shocker.
so,
Yeah, like,
so bad.
I
That's so
know
bad.
I
Shame
know.
on us.
I mean, don't tell anyone. Like, you should. Like, this is like the the cat is out the bag.
Yeah, it's a shame on us. What do we do? But why I raised the anti-Semitism point in relation to Iran is I wanted to connect this to the nuclear deal that the
Mm.
Americans. So basically, Obama started the nuclear deal. Trump came. It was put in the side burner, and then again Biden comes back and the nuclear deal is being discussed again. Now suddenly this entire protest starts, and so it was very interesting. I was listening to a former CIA guy, Mike Baker, on Joe Rogan, and he said, yeah, I don't think so Biden's going to do it now, especially coming from the current state of affairs in Iran. Signing a nuclear deal with them would kind of suck. Right now they have to pretend that they don't like Iran. So I
It's
don't know.
also stupid. I mean, look, I know. Look, I'm just going to be Trump here, but I think that, look, without being a Trumpist, I would say that that was one of the best decisions that an American president could have made at the time, to just get rid of it. Because you talking, but at the time that was true. But the notion that years and years down the line you could then try to revive, a deal that makes no sense, completely redundant now, because we were talking about, enrichment at 30%. They are at 70% now. What deal are you talking about? The bomb is already there. They can make it now. It's not going to be super practical. It's going to be clunky. It's going to take, like, I'm not saying that they can target the West. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying in terms of the whole idea of the deal was to prevent for the technology to be acquired. The technology has been acquired. What deal do you want to sign? Is like telling someone, you're pregnant, let me give you a contraceptive. What? It's too late. I mean, it's done. Like, the person is pregnant. The contraceptive should have happened before, but it didn't. So there you go. Now we need to deal with the situation. But again, the notion that Biden is saying, like, oh, we might be considering, reviving the negotiation. What negotiation? What are you going to negotiate? The color of the paper upon which you want to sign? What is it that you're doing? It's for me, it's just a ridiculous exercise in diplomacy that is giving people the impression that Washington is actually remotely interested in peace in the Middle East, which it is not, because it's not doing anything towards it, and actually would much rather concentrate on hating on China, even though China, in my mind, and I'm sure I'm going to be hated on for saying this, is not the most immediate threat that we're facing. I think that Russia and Iran are much bigger problem at present. And also, I would argue that China is a more rational enemy, and that whatever upsets we may have with China could be sorted with a very robust strategy. It's not out of hand yet, and there's plenty of common ground. So there's a lot could be done. Not saying it's not a problem; it is that we need to address. But I think that when you have a nuclear, Iran looking at us, and let's say that this is my biggest issue. China can wait for just a second. Iran, no, we need to do something. But Washington is not interested. Washington is all about China right now, and the Islamic Republic, they're kind of washing their hands from it. So.
Yeah, but so what do you think about the progress being made in the Trump regime with the peace deals with the Middle East,
The
all those
Abraham
happening?
Accords. I mean, Trump
Yeah,
did the Abraham Accords.
yeah.
Whether people, people have this thing that they do is that if they don't like someone, or a particular political party, whatever good that party is going to do does not matter. And I think it's wrong. You need to judge people on what they do. Okay, what they say too, but what they do. And in this case, Donald Trump gave us, the scrapping of the JCPOA, which was a great development. Also, during his presidency, Iran was less of a problem. So it means that whatever strategy he decided to, to keep worked to some extent, right? I think he bought us a few years. And then also the Abraham Accords, you can't take that away from him. No one can take this away. Obama did not do the Abraham Accord. Biden certainly didn't. Trump did. Trump did good. He did what everyone said was impossible. When people talked about normalization between, for example, the UAE and Israel, people were laughing, saying like, "You're dreaming. You're a nut job. It's never going to happen. It's impossible. They hate each other. Blah 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 blah." Well, Donald Trump rolled into the White House. He appointed Jason Greenblatt, who's absolutely fantastic and marvelous in my book. And he then went on this kind of campaign to try to to have a real discussion with Arab capitals, and it worked. It worked. And I think again, when I think that Donald Trump knew who to appoint and who was best to do that job. And again, I think that Jason Greenblatt was the architect of the Abraham Accord as far as I'm concerned, and he had this amazing ability to listen to people, and again to find common ground and to show through immense respect and tolerance and compassion that the future could be very different. That there was no need to continue all the hate and to be locked into those dynamics that others created for us.
I wanted to talk to you about one more thing that I read. You wrote this in the Jerusalem Post, if I remember correctly. Yes, you did. So it was on the
I did,
Russian Iranian Axis.
yes,
So what can you summarize that if you wanted? Because before I start taking the viewers' questions, I wanted to talk about
sure,
that too. So
sure.
what specifically about the Russian Iranian tie? Because the India and Russia have an old friendship. So I'm really interested in this one.
Mm. Well, Russia and the Islamic Republic have had an ongoing friendship, for going on a good 20 years. And there's been when Putin reached power, there was there was an envoy sent to Tehran, because I think that Putin understood that the ideology, or at least how he envisioned, legitimizing his own power and the trajectory that he wanted to follow, was very much in line with that the Islamic Republic in the way that it was formulated. The instruments that the Islamic Republic were using to coerce people, the misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, education system, how they managed to kind of keep people within the mold. Putin was curious and interested, and also for very obvious economic reasons. Russia always had an eye on on Iran. And so, started a conversation with their respective chief propagandists. So essentially, friendships were built there. And over the years, it kind of manifested differently. But obviously now, I would say, things have kind of, moved forward maybe at a faster pace with Ukraine. I was just concerned. The reason why I wrote this article is because I was concerned that we were missing and misreading signals in the Middle East, and that we were underplaying the relationship between Russia and the Islamic Republic, and that people were caught in this old, the old idea that Russia was very much calling the shots, and that Russia had territorial ambitions within Iran, and that Iran was kind of like playing it on the back foot. It's not the case. They see each other as partner. I'm not saying that Russia doesn't have, an agenda, with Iran and vice versa. But it's more to do with an alignment of ideology, which is quite interesting, because that means that the governance of the jurist is actually translated into the Christian world, and into the West. There's a danger there, because it means that they've been able to kind of like, transpose their vision, their political vision. That bothers me. Also, the fact that there's military cooperation. Now, again, when I talk about military cooperation, I don't want people to misunderstand me and suddenly say that, the Islamic Republic is like military power and that, we're all in danger. No, what I'm saying is that what they're trying to do is to project a sense of strength, that they are trying to bully our Western capitals by saying we have an axis, a military axis against you. The last time that happened, I think we have a bad case of PTSD, with Hitler, and the fact that, again, the blocks were being formed. We need to be careful, because I know they're playing into this. They're playing into old fears. And again, we should not discount it. It's there. We need to be careful. And it's intolerable that, for example, Iran is sending drones to Ukraine to be used against innocent civilians. We should not tolerate this. At the same time, we should not understand this as like, oh my God, Iran is sharing, military technology with Russia. We're talking about very clunky, drones that can't do much other than obviously sow fear within civilian populations, and it's a form of psychological warfare by, relentlessly aggressing them. But again, it's not tolerable. And I think also that we should read into this as this desire that the Islamic Republic to project that it's doing fine, everything is good. Look at us, we're sending drones, outside the country. We're doing good. No, they're not. They're teetering on the edge. And the reason why they feel the need to kind of externalize their power is because they're not doing so good within their borders, and that it's an attempt to change the narrative, to foment chaos somewhere else, so that people will not so much be troubled about what's happening within Iran. And it has worked in the past. And also, I think there's an attempt to generate some kind of a conflict, whether regional or not. Because the last time that happened, Iran was able to consolidate its position within its borders. For example, if Saddam Hussein had not attacked Iran when it did in the 1980s, the Islamic Republic would have most likely died, and it would have been rejected by the people. But because the people were at war, they had to kind of give it up to the leadership and say, well, you deal with it, because, that we have Iraqis literally bombing us. So, we're not in the mood of being revolutionary right now, and we can't afford it. So there's a danger. And also, obviously, the notion that the Islamic Republic continue to perpetuate that, there are greater enemies out there, mainly Israel and America. And so a conflict with those powers would be very handy, because you could then rally around the Shia Muslim world saying, we are at a state of war, Islam is on the line, come and help us, come and save us. That's basically what they're trying to do. It's complicated. But Russia is definitely playing an interesting role within that. And I think that Putin envisioned himself as the Russian Ayatollah, if that makes sense, in that the kind of powers that he wants to claim for himself. And also, how does he legitimize his position and his claim? I mean, he's president right now. He can't be president forever, can he? So he's going to have to kind of upgrade. And I think that, looking at the way that the Ayatollahs have done it, he might be thinking it's not a bad idea. And he has increasingly used the Orthodox Church to legitimize his position, and also sell, the war in Ukraine as a holy crusade for the Orthodox Church. So again, interesting and very dangerous if it becomes normalized.
Well, maybe Putin can take inspiration from Xi Jinping and become president for life. So He
Who
has a
knows?
role model there. He has
Who
a
knows?
role model there. All right, let's take some questions before we wrap it up. So this question takes us right back to the topic. It says, basically, I think this was asked when we were talking about pluralism. So how does one talk about pluralism in societies where Islamism is pretty much top down, being shoved? So because aren't they like literally opposed to each other in a scenario like this? um Iran, in that sense, I'll add to this question, is a complex society. Like, people always tell me, oh, gender surgery in Iran is legalized, but people only share that part. They don't share the part why it is legalized, because it's a highly homophobic society. It could
Yeah,
not tolerate that, so they legalized gender
exactly.
gender
Exactly, but
surgery.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I mean I've heard people making the argument before, um, that Iran was such a modern society and forward thinking for allowing it. I was like, well, there's a caveat. It's not. They're not doing it because they want people to have the freedom, to decide for themselves how what they want to do with their body. It has to do with abiding by um, certain rules, and then obviously they don't want to admit that homosexuality is actually a thing. And so they often actually forcing people to have gender reassignment surgery by telling them, well, it's easy, so we're going to have to just like shove you from a building. So it's not exactly I don't know, I don't think it's very tolerant. People should be given a choice, but hey, that's me.
Yeah, well, so basically, fundamentally, there is a problem between pluralism and Islamism, which I
I don't
think.
think I don't think they go well together. I mean, I don't think you could use them in the same sentence either. um, Islamists are not tolerant of other people's views. I mean, they don't. Again, any form of criticism leveled at them is an act against God, therefore passible of death. So how can you have pluralism within that? I mean, you could have maybe variants of Islamism if that pluralism would mean for them, but that would be it. Like, in Iran, you have the reformists and this and that, but they pretty much are, saying the same thing, except that they want to use different, colors to do it, different tones. But ultimately, the language, the narrative is the same, and it leads to authoritarianism. Um, so pluralism doesn't exist in Iran.
Mm. Do you think, someone has asked, do you think Iran was a democracy before the Shah was installed or put there by the West?
Iran never really had a democracy. It attempted. It was on its way to. Now, look, when we talk about the monarchy, it's tricky because you can't deny that under the Shah, the last Shah, that Iran was undergoing incredible reforms, that it was being modernized, and that also, as a king, he abolished the feudal system that Iranians were under, and allowed millions of people to have access to free education, which they didn't have before. So to some extent, I would say, because he was interrupted, that I think he was moving the country towards a constitutional monarchy, very similar to what we have in the UK.
Hmm.
But he was interrupted. So it's very difficult for people to say, well, they had a Shah and they didn't have any freedom, but that's not true. It started off with very little freedoms, but then the Shah came and kind of like he was going towards that. And again, he was interrupted by the Islamic Republic, so we'll never know where that road would have led. But also, we need to understand that because Iran was opened up so much in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s to the rest of the world, in that students went to Harvard and Yale University in the UK and France, and they went everywhere, and they learned. And so I think that the idea was for them to come back, and then started this kind of conversation around democracy and the economy and society, and how do we move forward, and what is it that we do that would work within our traditions and our history. And I think things were happening. You were this kind of like enlightenment that was pioneered by the Shah. If he didn't make this available, it would not have happened. So I want to be careful and say that I think the Shah was actually quite democratic in his ambitions, that he didn't have the time to implement it, but also that we shouldn't get bogged down by the fact that democracy in our minds can only exist if you have, under a Republican system, for example. I think that democracy could mean different things for different people at different times. And that, again, my experience as a Westerner, born in France, raised in, child of the Republic, my experience, my understanding, my wants for myself in terms of what do I understand as a democracy is very different from someone in Iran, for example. And that my experience is not, or my wants are not better or higher or more, idealistic than that of an Iranian who might want the return of the Shah, who might want a republic, who might want, I don't know. It's not for me to decide. So we need to be very careful and actually get, our definitions quite clear about what that means. But were people doing better under the Shah? Certainly. They were getting there. And I think that because they didn't have time to have that conversation, Islamists, arrived, then they got interrupted. But also, when we talk about democracy and democratic advancement, you have to understand that people need to be educated to get there. It doesn't just happen in a day. People need to understand what that means. And not everyone can exercise, their democratic rights just because somebody just shove it down their throat and say, now you can go and vote. We tried in Yemen and it didn't work. People can't read and write. So you need to firstly educate people. You need to make them understand, those are your rights. What do you want to do with them? So they could formulate, something, a want for themselves. Until you do this, it's impossible. Democracy will fail. We tried in the Middle East. It didn't happen. So we need to learn. And I think Iranians are extremely sophisticated, very well educated. They have a history that spans thousands of years. So that they're literally older than the West. I think, if anything, they have a thing or two to teach us, except that they were interrupted by a violent, abominable government, the Islamic Republic, and they got stuck.
Fair enough. All right. So this question is, assuming the regime is ousted and IRGC and Bunyad, the Islamic charity, influence is removed from Iranian society and the economy by the new government, would it result in a situation similar to what happened in Iraq, or it could even go worse?
It all depends about what happens after, obviously. So once the regime is gone, IRGC is gone, dismantled, outlawed, banned, dissolved, disappeared. Iran is an extremely wealthy country with incredible resources, incredible opportunities. And it would be down to the next government to do something with it and about it. Now, do I have a crystal ball? Can I tell you, yes, it's going to be fantastic? I hope so, because I think Iranians deserve, a little bit of happiness and also a brighter future. Do I believe that they will? Yes, because I do trust them. I trust that they've faced horror and evil for decades now. So they know what it looks like. I don't think that anyone will be able to ensnare them ever again. Not at least for a very long time. I think they've learned so much and suffered through so much that I would imagine that Iran would be in the next decade a brilliant country. It's going to thrive and flourish, and I think that people will be proud once more, to call Iran home and to be able to be free. I really believe that. I want to believe that. But it all depends on what happens next. And my fear is that if we do not empower Iranians and allow them to again move forward and succeed in getting rid of this regime and having the democracy that they want and the democracy that they deserve, that we're going to have an Islamic regime 2.0. We had it in Afghanistan. We need to be careful. And the only way to secure a better future for Iranians is to empower Iranians and not tell them what to do, not try to, to stir, them right to left or whatever, but to empower them, accompany them, and listen to what is it that they are telling us and the many ways that they're asking for our help. That's what we need to do. To ask them, what is it that I can do for you? And then give it. And not try to push, and to say, oh, I think you should do this. No. Iran is, again, a very sophisticated society. They are well educated. They can decide for themselves. They have brilliant minds in this country. Most of them have in prison, unfortunately, right now, which is why they can't speak. But they don't need our advice in moving forward. They can do it themselves. It's just hopefully hopefully the West will back off a bit. But right now, the West is not doing enough. And that's my main problem. So now the West is just more preoccupied with empty words and promises, but not so much actions on the ground. And I think it comes from cowardice.
Fair enough.
But that's my assessment.
So someone has asked, if you had to make an educated guess, what percentage of Iranian common people really support the Ayatollah Islamist regime, and what percentage are just people seeking their own version? I'm not saying the Western version of democracy, their own version of a democracy. Are there any surveys that have actually been done?
No, but my research tells me that about 25% of the country supports the Islamic Republic in one way or another. Now, within this percentage, you need to understand that a lot of people are supporting the Islamic Republic not out of ideology, but because it's safer for them to do so in terms of having access to certain social privileges, for example, health, education, things like that, being paid a salary. There are economic realities that bear very heavy on that percentage. But in terms of ideology, I would say that except for a few lunatics, most people within the regime actually don't believe a word that they, what they say. Very few people actually believe in the whole, governance of the jurists and this version of Shia Islam that they created. It's more to do with, personal interest and the fact that, having power is quite seductive, and however they justify that power and rationalize it to the population, they don't really care. They will say whatever. They would say that the Easter Bunny is sitting on the throne eating Sunday ice cream every Sunday. If they had to maintain power, they would. So it's not that they believe so much. What they believe is that the ideology is serving them. There's a difference. So it's not so much the content of it; it's the fact that it works, and also allows them to rally the troops around in terms of other Muslim country, positioning themselves as a great defender of the Islamic faith. And you can see this a lot with the Palestinian cause, how the Islamic Republic, who didn't really care about Palestinians before, and actually never done anything for Palestinians per se in terms of humanitarian aid or whatever. They understood it was a political weapon and an ideological weapon that they could use to take the shine away from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is home to the two holy cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina. And so Saudi Arabia became the custodian of those two holy cities, giving Saudi Arabia this, very prominent status within the Islamic world and, the Middle Eastern region. And Iran was after this. Ayatollah Khomeini wanted to take that mantle away from Saudi Arabia, claim it for himself, and say he was the guardian of Islam. And the best way he could do it was to create, was through the Palestinian cause, by positioning himself as the great defender of Palestine, and therefore Al-Aqsa Mosque, playing into this religious tradition that, Jesus will return to Al-Aqsa, and that therefore it had to be under Muslim rule, and also somewhat linking a person's exercise of the Muslim faith, as in, are you a good Muslim? How can you be a good Muslim if you don't support the Palestinian cause? And linking this in opposition to, in a rejection of Israel, other than say, you could be, being a good Muslim had nothing to do with Palestinians, but to actually defend and to be actually pro-Palestinian entails being pro-Israeli, and that it's not a zero-sum game. That you could do both. You could be, you could be pro-Palestinians, but that means being pro-Israeli and vice versa. The two are not, mutually exclusive. Because if you want the two people to live side by side, you have to support them together. You can't say that one is better than the other, or one has rights and the other hasn't. It doesn't work this way. So you have to admit that you have two people facing an incredibly complex problem, but that hate will not help. Division will not help. And certainly saying that one has right to exist while the other needs to go back to the chambers, it's not productive and will not happen, cannot happen. You can't say things like that.
Yeah, obviously, the death to Israel bit is not helping the case either.
It's abominable. And the fact that people in the West, still engage with the Republic and somewhat sanction that kind of language, it's just beyond me, because it irks me. Because this language should not exist anymore. You can't call for a genocide of an entire people on the basis of their ethnicity, or I don't care, political belief, religious belief, it doesn't matter. And the regime has got away with it by saying, oh, we don't, we mean Israel as in like the Zionist entity as opposed to. No, I don't care how you meant it or how you're trying to explain it to the rest of the world. You cannot say things like that. Can you imagine if, for example, someone in the UK was to say, death to the French because they're stealing our fish? It would be there would be an outcry, at the United Nations. The media will go nuts. When the Islamic Republic says it, you can't say anything or you're going to upset them. I don't care. I mean, we have certain standards and principles. I mean, you cannot say things like that.
Well, obviously, you should not say things like that, but the way things are these days, you can say anything pretty much as long as you have the right people to cover, and which is why common sense has been lost. So how do I guess how do Iranians then go about this? Then this is the last question before we wrap it up. Like, do they have a government in exile? How do they go about it? Like,
it's complicated. It's just, I keep, to be honest with you, I don't have an answer. I would love to, because then I would just go on Twitter and tell them, here you go, take it, go.
oh my God, Catherine, how dare you say you don't have an answer in the day of social media expertise?
Well, first of all, I'm not Iranian, so as far as answers go, it's not for me to find. I mean, do you understand what I'm trying to say? It's not like I don't care. I do care, but I'm also very conscious of the fact that it's not my problem to fix. In that, I don't want to be arrogant. I don't want to tell them what to do, because I'm not Iranian. I haven't lived an Iranian life. Therefore, how could I have an opinion? I'm conscious of that. Of course, I have opinions, and I think that there's certain things that we could explore. It's hard because what do you do? So you have, I mean, technically speaking, you still have, the royal family that could, that I believe should have a role to play within this, because they are the guardian of a certain tradition that does matter. Because if you want to move forward, you need to look in the past and use what you have to make sure that you have very solid foundation. You can't just create a system and hope that it's going to take. So it's important that, the monarchy, or at least like Iranians need to have a conversation with the monarchy, because they were the last one, taking care of the country. So I think that they have at least one or two advice to give, I think, in terms of like how they should go about doing it. Obviously, you have the issue of the constitution in Iran. Can we make the argument that it's not legal and legitimate by making the argument that it was engineered consent, that people were lied to in the referendum? They were promised free electricity, free housing, free whatever. And so, obviously people at the time were not as literate as they are right now. So again, engineered consent, is it legal and legitimate as far as the international community is concerned? In which case, we could very easily say, well, we do not recognize, the government of Iran anymore. We will, get rid of their representative diplomats and outposts from our capitals, because they have, no room. And, we need to create a government in exile. But then the next question is, who would sit on that government in exile? Because again, most political, activists and all the people that have formulated solutions for what happens next are sitting in Evin prison. Those are the core of the, intellectual, political Iran. Those people who are best, I would say, equipped and have popular legitimacy, because they have, people are following them, supporting them, listening to them, believing in them, wanting them, to continue what they're doing. Now you have, obviously, the Iranian diaspora. But the argument could be made, how divorced are they from what is happening in Iran? When someone has spent 40 years in exile, how connected are they to the everyday, oppression that Iranians have endured? And are they the best carrier of popular legitimacy, understanding that they haven't lived through what Iranians have lived through? And I'm not saying that it's their fault, that they should feel guilty about it. What I'm saying is that conversation that we need to have. So maybe we need to have a balance of the two. It's complicated, but until we actually have some kind of a task force set up saying, let's have this conversation, let's, throw things on paper, let's discuss them, and actually maybe use the power of social media to tell Iranians, can we have some kind of an informal, referendum. What do you guys want? Like, what structure are we looking at? Like, what do you want us to help you with? Maybe that's the better question. Then my answer is I don't know. I don't know. We could look into history and say, well, those things have worked in the past. We could also say, well, those things definitely didn't. So can we tweak them? Can we make them better? Can we learn? Yeah, we need to have a conversation. But I wish I had a solution. I don't have one because I don't know. I love to have a magic wand and say, first, I'd like the regime to go. But I'm also conscious that if it goes, we're going to have a power vacuum, and that's the most dangerous thing to have. And so we need to be careful. But also, how do you justify being careful and cautious and taking a long time to discuss things when people are dying? There's a sense of urgency. Human life is on the line. I personally, think that human life is precious. One life is too many to be lost. And it's very difficult for me to justify waiting when people are dying right now, yesterday. I don't know how to do that. So it's a problem.
Well, see, which is very unlike usually how people behave on social media. Social media is the place where everybody is an expert on everything and they have a solution for everything. So basically broken social media protocol. You
I'm
said
sorry. I tend to disappoint people sometimes because they expect me to say certain things. I'm like, no, I just don't
no,
want
you
to.
should not, and that's the right thing to do.
Just honest. I'm just
Yeah.
again. Sorry.
It is the right thing. No, I understand. I was just joking. It's like I wish more people had epistemic humility. The world needs more of epistemic humility. The kind of certainty with which I see people opine on things on social media, on everything. Like in the morning, they're talking about cricket. Then in the evening on politics, and then in between, if there's nothing else, they're talking about food. And with the certainty with which they speak on everything is just mind blowing. Like the whole thing that I started with this podcast was I was like, I don't know things, so let me talk to people who happen to know more in those
Um,
areas than I do.
I think that makes you a smart person.
I don't know.
I think it does.
Curious, definitely.
No, well, look, you can't. First of all, you can't be an expert on everything, and also, I think that a sign of intelligence is to actually question and admit that you don't know everything. Most likely, don't know a lot.
Yeah, most people don't, and I wish most people realize that, but they don't. But before we wrap it up, Catherine, any other new projects that you're working on that you would like to tell everybody about?
Well, there's quite a few things actually. I'm doing a research paper on the Islamic Republic when I'm looking at the ideology of the regime, but also the various instruments that it's actually using to perpetuate and consolidate its position within the ideology. Because Iran, a friend of mine actually coined that expression, is very modern in the way that it's enacting authoritarianism and playing it out. So I'm going to have to give it up to Ben Taleblu from FTT in the US. We had a panel discussion yesterday on I-24, and he was talking about this, and I agree with him. There's something so modern about the way that this new form of authoritarianism is being formulated and carried out, that I thought it was necessary to look into it, and to try to kind of get an understanding of what we're looking at. Because obviously, even if tomorrow morning the Islamic Republic is no more, certain tools have been utilized to indoctrinate people and maintain them in a state of subservience. And I think it's important that we look into it and study it to learn how to prevent it, and also what to do when it happens. So I'm doing this, and I'm working on various projects. Like I have an event coming up in Parliament on the 24th, where we're going to discuss the politics of anti-Semitism, which I think is actually quite relevant to the kind of conversation that we were having on anti-Hinduism in the UK. Because, there is one thing to say about what I say, like overt anti-Semitism, when people are, very aggressive on social media, very openly, anti-Semitic, but also how certain actors, whether, interest groups, political actors, political parties, are using certain language and playing into a certain narrative to isolate certain demographic. And Russia, for example, has used anti-Semitism to justify its intervention in Ukraine, certain things. The Palestinian authorities have certainly played into it. The Islamic Republic has used it, and various actors, whether left or right, by the way. And so I thought that it was a good kind of cornerstone event to kind of look into the politics of anti-Semitism, but also understand that it doesn't stop at anti-Semitism. That there's a trend in the UK that is rather worrying in terms of the politics of othering, and so hopefully it's a first to kind of lead to like a body of work into research into various othering, and of course anti-Hinduism is part of that. So hopefully we could have further conversation around that, and I could, because I'm not an expert on that, but I definitely want to look into it and see if we could do some work there, and hopefully change things.
Yeah, I look forward to working with you in that area too, and I'm going to maybe when the paper comes out, do let me know. I will definitely read this, and I like reading things. That's pretty much what my life is, reading books. So once again, Catherine, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast. It
My
was an
pleasure.
absolute pleasure talking to you.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for everyone out there, for bearing with us.
Hmm. All right, guys, we'll wrap today's discussion up. But once again, before I wrap today's discussion, it doesn't matter if you're listening to the audio version of this on Spotify or iTunes, or you're watching this on YouTube. In the description of the podcast, I have Catherine's Henry Jackson Society profile link. You can go and check it there. You can read all her You can also go on Jerusalem Post and you can read her articles there too. Or you can follow her on Twitter. As far as I'm concerned, you know the drill. Subscribe to the Cārvāka podcast YouTube channel. Like this video. Leave a comment. And if you can support this podcast, please become a member either on YouTube or Patreon or on Fanmo, or buy the merchandise or send your donations to UPI. I'll see you guys next time again with another new guest. Until then, take care. Bye.